Speaker is James Griffith. James is General Manager, Projects and Advisory for the Sustainable Business Network. He leads SBN's work to accelerate the circular economy in New Zealand. James has extensive commercial experience, having worked in large corporates and owned his own business. After James, tonight, our second speaker is Alec Tang. Alec is Auckland Council's Acting Chief Sustainability Officer and leads a team focused on creating a more sustainable, resilient and equitable Auckland. Most recently, the office has been focused on the development of Te Taruke Ātawhiri, Auckland's climate plan, which sets a path for rapid decarbonisation in line with the region's 1.5 degree commitment, whilst also preparing the region for the impacts of climate change. Now, because the circular economy is new to a lot of us inside the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, I've asked my fellow colleague on the CILT Northern Committee, Hari Srivastava, to just give us an overview to set the scene ahead of James. Now, the format for tonight will be that we'll have James talk to us about the circular economy and then in turn Alec, and after that we'll go into a panel session. So I'd like all of you participants tonight to please use the Q&A function on Zoom to send in your written questions that I will read out on your behalf during the panel session. Probably the most interesting part of it, to be perfectly honest, because a lot of the points that James and Alex are going to make is going to be the subject of what will be a very interesting discussion. And before we get into the first speaker and get into Hari's scene setting, I'd just like to say that the circular economy to our membership is very new. So we hope that after this first session that we're able to run a similar online and maybe even physical follow-up sometime in 2021, because CE is actually crucial to our business, be us transport providers or logistics providers. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my esteemed colleague Hari to set the scene for tonight's event. Thank you, Hari. Actually, Hari, I think you're going to have to take...
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Rob.
Way to go.
Thank you, Rob. I welcome James, Alec, attendees, and CILT members to this webinar. I am Hari Srivastava, associated with AUT Business School. I am, like many others, impressed by the novel concept of circular economy. I have found that the principles of circular economy revolve around using natural resources endlessly in order to reduce environmental impact, shortages, and costs. A famous butterfly diagram uses restorative and regenerative cycles to explain how technical and natural resources can be used endlessly. On the one hand, using natural resources endlessly seems like an overambitious goal due to the current profit-oriented economic system of taking, making, and discarding natural resources. On the other hand, the initial successful implementation of circular economy practices such as product life extension, refurbishment, or recycling in different industries plays a crucial role in changing customer behavior, government policies, and business practices, which in turn inspire other market players to introduce circular economy practices. Logistics is one of the important aspects that organizations consider when implementing circular practices. For example, Dell, Patagonia, and TerraCycle focus their circular economy efforts on implementing seamless take-back programs using turnkey packaging, pickup services, and prepaid return labels through innovative logistics solutions. This may require a close partnership with logistics service providers. So I will not take much of your time and hand over the stage to James. I welcome James to the webinar. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks so much for that, Rob and Hari. So yeah, it's great to be with you this evening talking about my favorite topic, the circular economy. So I work at the Sustainable Business Network, as you've heard. So just a bit of background about us. So we're an organization that's been around for coming up to 20 years, and we have a network of around 600 organizations. And we're really focused on working with them collaboratively on projects to create positive impact around key areas, for example, climate action to address climate change, regenerating natural waterways, and to addressing waste issues in New Zealand via a circular economy lens. So I'm just going to share a screen and run through a few slides. And so, I mean, what I plan to do is talk at quite a sort of basic level, if that's okay, around the sort of circular economy concept initially, and I'll sort of reference that butterfly diagram actually that you mentioned, Hari, and then I'll look to just to outline the opportunity from our perspective, and then how we can actually move to achieve this circular economy once we sort of understand what it is and what the opportunities are, and throughout I'll look to reference the intersections with logistics and transport, but I think they're going to be really fairly self-evident to you as an audience. So that's the plan. And then after me, Alec will ceremoniously throw me off, and he will be able to talk through his presentation. And then, but looking forward to questions at the end. So when, often if I talk about circular economy, I sort of start with this slide actually, in terms of illustrating, first of all, what it's not. So what it's the antithesis of, and that's a linear economy where we, take resources, extract resources, quite often they're non-renewable resources, make products with them, use them, and then sometimes only once and throw them away. Often though, when people hear about the circular economy, they quite often just think about recycling. And whereas recycling is part of a circular economy, it's only a small part, and it's actually probably one of the lowest value parts. And what we're looking at from a circular economy, as sort of Hari was referring to, is keeping those materials in high value circulation and out of the landfill effectively. So this is a version of that butterfly diagram that was being referred to, and it was developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK, sort of the preeminent type of organisation on a global scale, pushing the circular economy agenda. And it effectively shows the material flows, both from a biological nutrients material on the left and a technical perspective on the right. And effectively it's showing how materials sort of loop back via various business models like refurbishment, reuse, maintenance, and recycling, to capture value, to keep materials in high value circulation for as long as possible, and effectively keeping materials out of landfill. And on the biological nutrient side, looking at how the materials and biomaterials can be used to regenerate natural systems. So it's really based on those three principles. So design out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate natural systems. So I mean, in sort of many ways, it's a relatively simple concept. No, I haven't heard any arguments from anyone to say that this is a bad idea. So I think we're just really looking at how fast we can transition from that linear economy, which we're actually quite entrenched in, to one that's more circular. And and I'll start to sort of share some of the how I started to sort of become aware of the need for a circular economy, really how my mindset has basically started me down this path to be a advocate for this economic system. And because I think if we can have if we can put a circular economy lens across what we're currently doing, I think that's really a key leverage point to change, really, once we understand what the issues are of the linear economy and the opportunities for a circular economy in very simple terms. I think we can start to make real progress. So forgive me then if I just go through a bit of a personal story about how I started to recognize that I had a circular economy mindset. It was a good few years ago. I'm originally from the UK, and I was doing an A-level course in economics, and my economics teacher started to talk about the concept of built-in obsolescence and how car manufacturers used that to ensure that the cars didn't last as long as they could do, but so as a way of encouraging additional sales. And I remember being quite stunned by that and querying that strategy as surely that can't be legal. Well, in fact, the response was, yes, absolutely. It's a recognized business strategy, and isn't it great? Well, I don't think it is, really. And I think if you look at the amount of materials that are used and are wasted, it's fairly obvious that isn't a long-term strategy that anyone should be involved in. And then, so how far have we got with this sort of built-in obsolescence or planned obsolescence? And this was a couple of years ago when Apple were being investigated for doing effectively the same thing, effectively making products that are designed not to last, so that will encourage you to buy a new one. However, we are seeing, I believe, significant signs of change, at least from a customer perspective. Interestingly, the consumer magazine and entity in New Zealand have recognised that customers are getting fed up with the fact that it's often cheaper to throw something away and buy a new device or electrical good rather than actually getting it repaired. And so they've created this campaign that they've just recently launched, Built to Last. And it's around this, the right to repair, which is gaining momentum around the world to really put an end to built-in obsolescence. And at SBN, we've been working a lot on product stewardship, which is when businesses start to take responsibility for the environmental impacts of their products right throughout the life cycle, not just once they leave the factory gates. And so product returns is often associated with that. And the reason we're looking at that is because it's a real foundation block for the circular economy, and businesses starting to engage with the circular economy and its principles. And at the sort of start of this campaign, we did a survey. We got quite a few, over 800 responses to our online surveys, asking a number of questions about what businesses felt about the products they're procuring and product stewardship. And so that was a figure of respondents who felt that they wanted businesses to take products back at the end of life to be reprocessed. And so I think it's fairly obvious where the sort of logistics elements you can see start to coming in here when we've got materials at the end of life needing to be moved back to somewhere that can be reprocessed. As a part of that campaign is to is to showcase those organizations who have got product return systems in place, so that we can actually direct businesses towards those organizations, and encouraging that those businesses to put such systems in place. So I think we're seeing the real signs that the built-in obsolescence mentality and mindset is really on the way out. In terms of pretty obviously, why do we need a circular economy? I think with consumption increasing, as the population grows and the natural resources being continually depleted, I think we're at pushing now. We're using the Earth's resources about 3 times faster than they can be replenished. I mean, it doesn't really take a sort of scientist or economic analysis to understand that this cannot continue, this linear economy as we're going, and it's inevitable. We need to move to a circular economy. It's just how fast we can get there. I mean, also, other benefits I think Harry was referring to as well is the is cost savings from increased efficiency, as well as of materials, as well as reduction in congestion, and economic benefits. But also, crucially, this is a circular economy is a route to achieve the carbon reductions, or a significant part of the carbon reductions we need to reach the targets that we have to. So it'd be interesting to hear from Alec later on about in more detail about sort of carbon action. We commissioned a study along with a TEED, looking at what would a circular economy mean to Auckland from an economic perspective and a carbon reduction perspective. Some significant numbers there in both aspects, and that carbon reduction figure is equivalent to taking about 300,000 traditional motor vehicles off the road in 2030. So it's quite a significant impact if we move to a circular economy. Yeah, well, how are we going to do it? Well, that is a big question, and so we try to answer it. I'll try to answer it in just outlining the sort of key levers that we need to sort of work on to unlock that movement. And so the first one is design. We need to look to design for a circular economy. There's going to be a transition, so we're currently looking to really fit sort of circular economy solutions at the end of a sort of a linear product, which is required at the moment, but we need to get to a stage where we're actually designing from the get-go for products to be modular, so they can be so parts can be replaced. They're using safe and renewable materials, and effectively built to last. So this is a chair, designed by an organisation out of Queenstown, using natural, natural resources, some flax as a resin in that chair. It can be repaired, so it can be deconstructed. But importantly, the design ethos is to be timelessly elegant, and so it is meant that you don't want to replace this chair every few years. It's going to last. It's going to last aesthetically as well as physically a lifetime. So that's perhaps not a surprise that we need to start at the design stage. And then really connected to that is that demand. So when we spoke to designers around the circular economy, they say, look, we know how to design for a circular economy. In fact, we want to make modular products. We want to make products that are designed to last. but no one's asking us for it. And so that's where that demand side comes in. And so, you know, it's up to us to procure products that have circular attributes, and it's up to the sort of designers to make products that actually meet the core function in a way that's more appealing than their linear counterpart. So, I mean, this is an example of some Adidas trainers that have been made from plastic waste from the ocean, as a sort of making the circular economy desirable. The other aspect is around our, you know, business models, and a particular focus on access rather than ownership. So what I sort of do ask when I'm sort of in a sort of in-person presentation is for people to put their hands up if they have a drill in their home. So I can see Alec does, and I do, and I probably maybe 80% of the audience, I'd guess, do. And of course, the thing is, we don't actually need that drill. What we need is a hole in the wall that it produces. And there is a statistic that I read that the average use life of a drill is 19 minutes. So, and if that was, and in my experience, actually the use life of my drill is probably a lot less than that. So how can we access that drill to have that hole in the wall without owning it, keeping that sort of ownership with the manufacturer? The manufacturer is then driven, you know, has a driver to make the product last for a long time, you know. So that sort of changes the sort of the whole incentive for a lot of our economy. Now, a fourth leverage point is around infrastructure, and I put you know, there's an image of a recycling centre sign there, and the sort of the infrastructure to be able to process materials in New Zealand has been well highlighted, particularly recently, and with issues with regards to plastic packaging. But I think, but the point I really want to make now is that the infrastructure needs are also around logistics, and so we've had businesses that we work with talking about the frustrations they have with the logistics of New Zealand. You know, obviously, you know, quite geographically dispersed, sort of along the line. It's not great to get around. But from a business's point of view, trying to put processes in place for a circular economy, there's a business based in Auckland, and they import carpet tiles that can be reprocessed, not onshore but offshore. So they'll take them back and reprocess and turn them into new carpet tiles at the end of their life. And a frustration for them is that it costs them more to get the tiles at the end of their life back from Dunedin to Auckland than it costs them to send the tiles from Auckland to Dunedin at the beginning of their life, when of course the value of those tiles is much higher at the start of their life. And so you can see that the percentage of costs related to logistics is a bit of a barrier. Of course, you know, speaking to logistics organizations, I mean, the costs from, you know, are relative to them, and it costs, you know, what it costs to get products back and forth, regardless of the value of those products. So I think that's really, I sort of pose that as a question: is that an opportunity for the logistics sector to look at how they could work with organizations to address that frustration of reverse logistics, and the costs for the manufacturers are disproportionately higher because the value of that material at the end of its life is a lot lower. So that's maybe a question I can pose, and apologies if you're already well down the track on trying to answer that, and if you are, I'd love to hear how where you get to. The other point is how we can use technology from distributed manufacturing and manufacturing on time, on demand, like that 3D printing can offer, the use of artificial intelligence, etc. But also, on a more basic level, what we've obviously been seeing is platforms that can aggregate the available resources. So I know we're seeing that with logistics, and looking at how those platforms can help backfill empty trucks, for example, which may go some way to answering that question I just posed before. But again, I'd love to sort of hear thoughts on that. And then the sixth area is around the government intervention, and we're seeing quite a lot of that of late. So from the signal that the intention that the waste levy, which is currently a $10 charge per ton of waste going to certain landfills, will be extended and increased to provide a disincentive to put stuff in landfill, but also create a investment fund to invest in new circular solutions. But and also the announcement that there will be several product categories, or 6 in total, where there will be mandatory product stewardship, right through from packaging to refrigerant, to farm plastics, to tires, to e-goods. And so what that's going to mean, of course, is that those materials, goods, are going to need to be transported at the end of their life to reprocessing centers. So that's going to actually, unlock a significant amount more logistics opportunities and needs. So I'm just going to sort of finish with what sort of a reference to the next sort of steps for the SBN and our circular economy work. We are really looking to turn the dial on accelerating New Zealand towards a circular economy. We've done a lot of work, but we want to take it to the next level. We really want to focus on enabling New Zealand SMEs to go circular, to create a low carbon, just circular economy, creating jobs, reducing waste, and and achieving low carbon targets. So, and we're really keen to work with a logistics partner, because if you've sort of seen, and probably hope agreeing that logistics is going to be a key to this circular economy. So really keen, if anyone's interested in getting seriously involved from both an investment and time perspective, and influence perspective with our work, I'd love to talk to you. So that's where I'm going to leave it. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing what Alex is going to be talking about, and then look forward to hearing some, trying to answer some questions if there are any.
Well, thank you to James. And just before Alex jumps in, Thank you very much to James and to Harry before him for giving us this really interesting overview and to be honest, a much broader setting of the scene. I just want to say to all those participants, some of you who actually connected in while James was speaking, that the part of the presentation that you missed out, don't worry. It's all being recorded tonight and will be up on the CILT website within the next couple of days, along with James's slides and Alex's slides. Also, a reminder to please, any questions that you've got during this time, during the webinar, please use the Q&A function to put in written questions. The reason that we're not doing audio questions is that in the past we found that audio, because of internet lag and other network problems, we find that it's much better for the written questions to be submitted rather than audio ones. So please put your questions in because the panel discussion will kick off straight after Alec. So without further ado, Mr. Tang, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, Rob. Kia ora, James, for your introduction. Tēnā koutou kua whakaroaka mai, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Alec Tang toka ingoa, e mahi ana au hei pārahi mō te tari tikanga tōkonga roa mātua i te Konihera Tāmaki Makaurau. As Rob said, I'm Alec Tang, I'm the Acting Chief Sustainability Officer at Auckland Council. Now, what I wanted to do today was, James has given a great oversight of what the circular economy is and how we might get there. What I wanted to dive in just before the panel session is just to give a little bit more of the sense of the why. You know, why is it so important that we have this kind of transformation within businesses, within our economy, and so on. And I wanted to use the 2020 acronym of the year, COVID, as a real example or real kind of case in point as to why these kinds of changes are really critical. So I'm just going to rattle through a couple of slides just to hopefully set that context. And I think it's really important to recognize what COVID has done. And what COVID has done is clearly changed our fiscal context, changed the position that councils, that governments, that businesses are in fiscally at all scales. It's also really affected public attitudes to change in various levels, in terms of some people being now a lot more tired about, you know, the change that's happened, and many people wanting the end of 2020 to come quicker than it already is. But it's also reignited a lot of perspectives on what is possible. And I've been involved in a number of webinars and discussions about, hey, you know, what has COVID shown us? It's shown us what we could do, what we could become. And the third bullet on this slide, it's what COVID has not done. It has not changed this imperative to act on climate change and to think about transformation and disruption as a critical part of business, and how business operate. And for me, and so apologies those of you who've seen these kind of slides before, but for me, there are three key opportunities that have come out of COVID. The first one centers on different ways of working. Obviously, we've all had to do this kind of stuff more frequently. We've all had to think about how we work, how we live, how we play very differently. What's really important in thinking about this and learning from how we've done things differently is that COVID is an extreme. I was on a webinar this afternoon where there was a discussion about, you know, remote working. We, you know, can't possibly, it's so tough, and COVID's just shown us how tough it is. COVID is an extreme. I'm pretty sure most people are not going to want to work from home every day of the week. And actually, we're not necessarily just talking about working from home. We're talking about working from our local neighborhoods, maybe 2-3 times a week, which is going to actually have quite a significant impact on congestion, on emissions, on actually creating better places for our people. But we do need to understand what that shift will mean in terms of how we support our communities, our neighborhoods, how this affects the city systems that we have. And I'll come back to that system question, because I think that's where transport logistics has such an important role to play as this city is changing, as all our cities are changing to accommodate this new way of working. The second key opportunity, or the second key thing that COVID's shown us, is the importance of strong social networks in times of crisis and transition, the importance of neighborhoods, the importance of knowing people around you, the importance of facilities and services near you that you can access when other things shut down. So we need to use the experience of the first lockdown and the most recent lockdown, and potentially how we're operating in the next, 6 months, 9 months, however long it's going to take. We need to understand those networks and mechanisms. We need to use this time to really think about those inequalities that COVID has shown up. both in terms of the standard of our built environment, but also this access to healthy green space. One of the big things that we heard more in the first lockdown and the second lockdown was the frustration of Aucklanders around their inability to get to beaches, get to parks, to spend time in that natural environment, which we always knew was a critical part of personal resilience and community resilience. But that really was shown up strongly in the first lockdown experience, and less so in the second one because we had a little bit more freedom. But that inequality of green space, that inequality of urban ngahari and parks and so on, was really highlighted through the lockdown experience. And then the third one, which I wanted to flag, which is perhaps the most strongest overlap with what we're talking about this evening, is what we've got to realize is COVID is it spotlighted vulnerabilities. So we always talk about how do we respond to COVID? How do we respond to the impacts of COVID-19? What we really need to focus on is what COVID has shown us, and it has shown us that our systems are vulnerable, our economy is vulnerable, and those most vulnerable bits are the bits that have fallen apart quickest. And so what we need to do through COVID is to use it as a circuit breaker, or it is a circuit breaker, and we need to use that pause, that stop in our economy to really reimagine what the economy should be, kickstart this transition to a circular economy, a more resilient economy, something that's actually regenerative, that starts to put back into the planet everything that we've been taking out over hundreds and thousands of years, make it more distributed. So actually we can think about how we more equally distribute wealth within our economy. And obviously from my perspective, how do we make it really low emissions? Because that's going to be such a critical part of the next 10 years plus. And so it's really important that we look at reorientating business models, hence what James has been talking about and Hari before him, in terms of how do we focus on ensuring natural resources aren't extracted faster than they can be replenished. Let's recognize the fundamental importance of the natural environment, those natural resources to our economy. And at a city scale, so again, coming back to the systems component, how do we think about a city as not this 19th century collection of infrastructure that moves stuff around, to actually what are those critical systems that we need for our 21st century cities to thrive? And one of those key things that we saw through COVID is, with people working more remotely and people at home more, we had deliveries of goods, of shopping, of groceries coming to our doorsteps increasingly. And so what are those critical systems? And for me, or for us as council, how do we make sure we have this role as stewarding those systems, not just thinking about hard infrastructure, which is our conventional space in place? So that's really important from an opportunity perspective. So one of those three areas, and they all interweave, obviously, but real disruption that we will see and we will continue to see. It might not be another COVID, or it might not be COVID. It might be another pandemic. It will be climate change. Those impacts will happen, but there will be other things that come along. And so being more resilient as businesses, being more resilient as economy becomes so much more critical. Rob mentioned Te Tariki Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan, and I just wanted to spend a couple of slides just talking about that. Those of you who haven't seen it, we signed off on this plan back in July, which seems an age ago, but was actually only 3 months ago, just over 3 months ago. So that plan sets or it responds to two key goals that were set by council for the region. One is halving our emissions and reaching net zero by 2050. So halving our emissions in the next 10 years, reaching net zero by 2050, but also preparing for the impacts of climate change. Because even if we do that, climate change or climate impacts will appear in Tāmaki and New Zealand and across the world. There's a number of priorities that sit underneath it. But one of the key things that we've done is we've tried to model, well, what does halving our emissions actually mean? What does it actually look like? And so we did some modeling around what an indicative pathway might look like, obviously recognizing there are 1,000,001 different ways that you could halve your emissions. This is just one pathway. But what that showed us is the scale of transformation that's required, the scale of decarbonization that all sectors need to achieve. By 2030, to meet that 50% reduction, we're going to need these stationary emissions, stationary energy, so emissions from our buildings, from energy production, reduced by 65%. We need transport emissions to reduce by 64%, industrial processes, product use, 23%, agriculture, 15%, and even waste. We need that to basically stabilize, which actually means 24% reduction in our waste emissions. And what we did was we took a number of things and we modeled them, and we modeled a number of requirements for what we need to see. And I just highlighted here some of the freight related aspects that we need to achieve in the next 10 years. So we need to see 15% increase in fuel efficiency of the freight vehicle fleet of internal combustion engines. We need 40% of road freight to be electric or zero emissions by 2030. We need 8% of road freight to actually shift to rail. So here are some, hopefully, I don't know, slightly shocking, but hopefully not too shocking, but this is the kind of stuff that we need to do if we're going to reach that target of halving emissions by 2030, to keep within 1.5 degrees, or to do our part to keep within 1.5 degrees of warming. And so that's critical. Like, whether or not whether you like it or not, the transformation that all businesses need to go through, whether it's to respond to another disruptive event, whether it's a long-term disruptive event or a short-term one, is going to happen. That transition to a zero emissions economy, whether we like it or not, we're going to move to that spot, and you can either proactively do that, or you can actually, you'll effectively be made redundant because others will move first. And so there's a final point before I close and open up for questions. I get asked a lot about, well, geez, COVID-19, that's what you guys want to see. You want to see the economy collapse. You don't want to see any more economic growth because effectively that's what you need to halve our emissions and to reach net zero. And the critical thing is the outcomes. Yes, that's what we want to see, halving our emissions, net zero by 2050. But it's how we get there. COVID is a sudden shock that basically shut down our economy. The reason why we need to start acting now is that we need to make sure that transition is managed, that we can get to that point without the economy completely shutting down. And hence the imperative to think about new models, think about circular economy, think about more regenerative and distributive models, and embed that within all our businesses. So that's all I had to say, and I'll hand back to Rob.
Thank you very much, Alec, and thank you, James. As we move into the panel session, I'd actually like to preempt a question first off to James, and hopefully that will prompt some more interesting and, dare I say, provocative questions coming through subsequently. James, you mentioned that ATEED and SBN identified, in your study, identified 8.8 billion in additional economic activity. What type of activity are we talking about that would generate that amount of money?
Yeah, good question, Rob. Thanks. Yeah, so we actually just looked at 3 sectors, and they were transport and logistics. They were food, and there were food and beverage, and the construction sector. So sort of 3 fairly meaty sectors. And so it was a economic modelling, and so they had to look at real tangible type of actions. And so for example, in the transport perspective, it was increasing the life of vehicles was a key contributor. From a food perspective, even a simple aspect of keeping it out of landfills and reducing food loss and waste was a big contributor to that. And the reuse of materials from the construction sector, and again avoidance of putting it in landfills, was another big, I suppose, impact on that financial and carbon reduction side.
So you're saying effectively, James, that just pure avoidance would generate an additional, dollar figure in economic activity.
Yeah, it's basically there's a lot of waste going on in our economy, and if you just at a basic level start to take some of the waste out of the equation, then that's going to have a positive economic impact as well as a positive carbon reduction one.
And Alec, I've just got a question for you, based on the figure that you put up about, I think it was around electric vehicles, you know, the 40% target. Was that, and was a comment that came through just on the chat earlier from one of our members saying that would that not be more around achieving that target on a distance basis as opposed to per trip? Is it priority around the distance rather than the trip itself? How do you sort of define the figure in that case?
Yeah, sorry, and I don't know that Ryan may be still on the line, but Ryan is the lead transport advisor for council, so he knows this more than I do. What's important is there's a whole range of things that need to happen, and so that electrification of vehicles is one of those things that has to happen alongside the mode share shift. I think the point was it was mode share by distance, not by trip. I might have got my facts slightly skew around there, but fundamentally. It's not an or in those numbers. It's like to hit 50% reduction, we need to do all these things. But the caveat there is this is one pathway. So the point being that if we don't hit say 40% of new dwellings in transit orientated development, then we're going to have to do more somewhere else. And so that's the approach that we took to the modeling to say, here's a pathway, here's a stake in the ground. If we're not going to hit 40% or whatever, 40% of passenger and light vehicles to be electric by 2030, then we're going to need to find those emission savings in some other part of the whole system. And what we've tried to do is try and figure out, well, the technology is there for that kind of transition. In some of the other areas, which is like the industrial process, the industrial heat side of things, it's harder. The technologies aren't there. Hence the kind of it's only about a 23% saving. Now, if something came through and actually was a really great technology that would actually be easy to implement and meant that actually we could reduce process emissions by 40-50%, then that eases the pressure on transport. But at the moment, transport has most of the solutions now, and they're not even necessarily high technology solutions, the stuff around walking, cycling, all that kind of stuff. There is technologies here, which is why the focus is often on the transport side of things.
So to follow on from that, if you're talking just, Alec, as you say, about the incentives, the financial incentives, the carrots, for want of a better phrase, and coming back to you, James, talking about that opportunity for avoidance actually creating that additional economic activity. What kind of financial carrots should be, should local government or maybe it is in this case central government be injecting to basically push this along? Because as you said, Alec, COVID, for better or for worse, has actually given us the wake-up moment. And as you rightly said, we can't go back to what we did before. But my question is, and I'm sure some of the audience will chime in here as well, what do we need to do from a government perspective, from local and central government, to sort of kickstart things? What kind of financial carrots and sort of not sticks per se, but what needs to happen to actually move things along faster than they are now?
Well, and very frankly, we had some of that come through in the last 3 years that could have really provided that fiscal incentive. The policies that were kind of canned around fee baits and incentives for electrification. Just a couple of things though to throw in there. One is which kind of just links to James's point. We always talk about the costs now and the costs of implementing these schemes, and rarely do we think about the costs of not doing. And that's a really important thing. And it's hard. It's really hard. We get asked that a lot, and we don't have huge amounts of data. But unfortunately, we're increasingly seeing the impacts of climate-related events, and we're getting numbers through of incidents like floods and fires and all that kind of stuff. So we're starting to build that picture of the cost of not doing. So that's one thing, and needing to factor that in is really important. The second thing I'd just flag is this issue of equity. And so one of the really hard things to do around those fiscal sticks and whatnot is making sure that our response doesn't just emphasize or re-emphasize the inequities that we're currently seeing in the system, and being very careful about that. We know that there are inequalities and that some of the technologies are more accessible to certain demographics and so on. And we need to be really careful about making sure that whatever injections or whatever incentives you put in place, actually you recognize what implication that has for inequity, and you put something else in place. So that's why some of those policies that we're seeing coming through where it says, well, we know electrification is important, but we also know that not everyone can afford an electric vehicle. So we need to make sure that that incentive comes through in terms of public transport or some other subsidy for those people who can't afford that kind of thing.
Because as you were saying, and I see Ryan Falcon has just chimed in on what you're saying, that you could assume that 40% of freight kilometres by road could be actually done by e-trucks, for example. Or so I guess the thing is there has to be some kind of incentive from central government to increase the uptake of that. Now, I've got a question here from one of our members who's for both panelists, for both you, Alec, and for James. How do you balance the fine line between sustainability and exploitation? For example, more lithium mining, let's say, for making car batteries, but the requirements go to electric transport for sustainability. How do you basically get that fine line between creating something sustainable that isn't actually ending up exploiting someone or something along the track?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's one thing is I think you need to think, holistically, be aware of implications and unintended consequences, and be directionally be confident of which what's the direction of travel you want to take as an organization. But there are it basically comes down to doing the analysis, but recognizing that it's pretty difficult for each individual organization to do their own analysis. So it's down to working with organizations who can and actually provide that sort of source of truth from an unbiased perspective.
Yeah, and if I think that's really right, James. But I also think we need to, and the question about electric vehicles and batteries is always gets raised, and of course we need to be better at scrutinizing supply chains and so on. The other thing is to remember what we're comparing it against. So we're thinking about an electric vehicle versus a fossil fuel vehicle, and we think about equity and inequality, and the fossil fuel industry hasn't got the greatest track record there either. So there's a huge amount of complexity in this issue, which requires us to dive into these solutions really well and be quite robust, make sure we're not going out of the frying pan into the fire. The other thing I would say as well is, as I said, like, electric vehicles are great in terms of, they're a solution now that can help us get to 50% by 2030, and really important that we hit that number for emissions purposes. But actually, does it take us to the world that we need to be? Does it just reinforce a car-centric, car-dominated world, which has a whole bunch of other issues? No, it doesn't. It doesn't solve those problems, but it helps us get to this emissions story. So we've got to kind of, and this is the thing, we've got to balance up all those various things, and make sure that we're not just looking at one thing in isolation, which I think is the point here, but actually think of that broad system that we're working within. And it's hard. But actually, that's what we need to do if we're actually going to get to this more resilient and regenerative future, that we're not just basically taking more out of the planet than the planet can sustain.
Yes, it's interesting. We were just talking, obviously, about electric vehicles and the method of transport delivery, because this actually leads on to another question here from one of our members. If you're looking at the extension of the life of a road transport vehicle, it can obviously be achieved, but only at the expense of additional maintenance. And as you know, there's a finite break-even point where the simple extension of the life of a vehicle becomes economic. So how do you sort of, basically reconcile that? Because, I mean, you can think about the fact that, how do you, I guess in a circular economy, we've been talking about the value of actually, making sure, and James, you brought this up, all the vehicles sitting in a field, that slide that you had, that, these things and so many other things are made to have a life shorter than they should be, deliberately to sell the next model. But again, the thing is, if we're looking at from a road transport vehicle, how do you sort of try and reconcile the fact that, and if I have the question from this particular member, Graham Wilson, and Graham, you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, how do you reconcile the fact that, you have the trucks out there, we all want them to go electric, let's say, and we obviously want them not to end up in landfill and not to be part of that photo, James, that you showed earlier. But there is that sort of finite break-even point where the simple extension of a life of a vehicle becomes an economic issue. And sort of how do you sort of kind of reconcile that? Because it's not one size fits all, surely. That's Graham and my collective question.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely not one size fits all, and I suppose that's where it sort of comes back to my my original point is putting a circular economy lens on across your decisions. So at least you're consciously making those decisions. You know, is it going to be better for me to extend the life of this or not? So that's if we can get those considerations in the decision matrix, then that's you know, a plus. But the other thing comes back to that, you know, thinking about the, you know, holistically and thinking about the long term. You know, is it ownership? You know, is it sort of more of the leasing? Is it more of the looking at other modes? What are the future modes that are going to be coming through and started to make more economic sense as well? So it's really around having that, I think, that holistic view and you know, a plan for the long term, not just the immediate term.
Yeah, and I think, James, that point's really important. You know, there's this component of, do we need what we currently have? Like, effectively, and from a climate and emissions perspective, just decarbonizing business as usual just won't cut it. We need to really rethink, like, how we're using things, what are we using, why do we use it, do we actually need to do it that way? And as I kind of pointed to, you know, COVID's challenged some of those. You know, do we need to do it a certain way? You know, remote working, we'll go back to it. As an organization, the council has had the functionality to do remote working for as long as I've been at council, 4 and a bit years. Did we use it? No. Do we now know how to use it? Yes. We can do business in a completely different way. And that took us, what, 3-4 months. And now everyone can do things very differently. And I guess back to my point, that's the kind of disruption that we're going to see. So we can't just think about electrifying trucks and all that kind of stuff. As a logistics sector, you're going to have to think about, what are we moving around? Are we moving things around? What services are we delivering to enable people to do the things that they're going to start moving to? And whether we like it or not as an industry, that's the way it's going to go. And being kind of forward thinking enough to go, well, actually, what is my role in the system? What is the piece that I'm playing? And how do I do that in the most sustainable, least impactful way? Is the key question that and not just, you know, not just this sector, but every sector needs to be asking that, to be future-proofing itself, because these kinds of questions are happening consciously, subconsciously by everyone around the planet.
And just picking up from that, and it's also a similar question which has come in, which I think has a slightly interesting angle on this. If you actually compartmentalize down what you've described, Alec, and you bring it down to, let's say, a neighborhood level, or maybe, for example, industrial area neighborhood level, we're already, as you know, seeing the changes through COVID, traditional trucks not being able to get into certain areas, and so therefore there's been an uptake and people using more hand trucks to get into particular areas, or using cargo bikes, e-bikes, for example. So does this mean that at a very much at a local level, at a grassroots level, do you think, Alec, there needs to be a lot more activity in a much more local level to kind of make these kind of changes? Is it all very well for government to prescribe certain ways of doing things, but is the reality that, you know, it's down to the small logistics companies and maybe the smaller areas they're serving? There's the way to actually affect the change and to create a sort of a circular economy much more at a grassroots level?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, you know, and you highlighted it before, Rob, you know, there's not one size that fits every kind of everything. But I do think that what I've seen is very much around localization and communities, and the fact that people have found their local environments, that they were forced to look around their neighborhoods and see what's there, go down to their local shops and not travel so far, and actually found some benefits from that. I think is important from a kind of a people push almost. But the other thing, and it goes to my slides, like that community cohesiveness is going to be critical when we have more and more crises. So knowing who's in your neighborhood and knowing what you can do locally is important from a resilience perspective as much as it is from a potential decarbonization perspective. Are we going to get everything locally? I don't know, maybe not, but we can definitely do more local, and that can help from a whole range of things. So I think, again, you know, we don't know where we'll be in the, I think that's the other thing COVID showed us. We really don't know where we're going to be in the next week, let alone the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or whatnot. And this is the thing. It's enabled us to potentially think very differently about how we're doing stuff, and just not to be so constrained by, well, this is how we did things in the last 5 years, so we should do it again for the next 5 years. We were doing completely different things 4 months ago, 3 months ago.
So following off on that, one of our other members has got a question for both you, James, and for Alec. How do you get countries like New Zealand to really recycle our own waste? Does incentivizing the waste recycling within the country rather than exporting it is a better way to go? Will it help push the general public towards being more sustainable and being more mindful of creating that circular economy at a grassroots level?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, various studies and you know, have shown that there is you know, a high intention for New Zealanders to want to recycle, and so I think it's really about the sort of the local infrastructure sort of catching up in terms of enabling that at scale. So and you know, it's not an unfamiliar story around the globe, really, in terms of you know, low value waste, as particularly plastics, was exported en masse to Asian countries for goodness knows what happens to it. But well, I think we're now realizing or acknowledging that, you know, some not great practices were happening with our plastic, which meant that a lot of it's ended up in our seas, unfortunately. So really, I think it's, and I think we're making the moves. It's around being more, you know, resilient as a nation. I think, you know, COVID has put a lens of urgency and recognition across that, and as Alex was sort of referring to. Yeah, we're you know, looking at opportunities for you know, job creation and that sort of supply chain resilience, and right up, you know, from the from you know, initially right out through to end of life. I'm talking about that supply chain resiliency, and sort of onshore increased onshore processing is going to be a part of that.
And part of that, just before I, you know, Alec, you comment on that, the one thing I was wondering is, how much does COVID have an effect on this? Because arguably you could say, and we had a webinar last month looking at port relocation, and there was just a side comment which said that, you know, there's a certain amount of import traffic, you know, via ship which has dropped, but not considerably. So, for example, that means that, you know, how do we, does COVID present us the opportunity? Because already, for example, pre-COVID, Malaysia was turning our rubbish back and saying, no, we're not having this anymore. China was doing the same. So therefore, with COVID, you know, disrupting on a more sort of semi-permanent basis, is that actually forcing us to think, well, gee, you know, the old ways, as you say, Alec, we just can't do this anymore. We've actually got to really man up and recycle our own bloody stuff, you know, within the country. Is that really going to be the way in which we affect change? Is that the way to actually, you know, change the way in which we look at how we produce, you know, shifting our linear economy to a circular one?
Was that for me, Rob, or?
Well, actually, both of you, to be honest. James, do you want to comment on that? And Alec, I'd like to hear from you too, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I think it was already moving in that direction before COVID. I think COVID's put a particular spin on, realistic, you know, spin on perhaps a direction that was already happening. You know, what I think the, you know, opportunities for New Zealand are to actually, yeah, make increase the value we can derive from all materials that we currently have here in New Zealand. You know, how can we develop our remanufacturing sector, for example, to create, you know, both that supply chain resiliency, economic benefits and jobs, as well as sort of reducing waste levels. So I think it's a context that has put a different but complementary, let's say, need to move towards more circular economy.
Yeah, and look, I think, you know, and looking at this fundamentally, I think the whole point is that we want to try and not have waste, isn't it? And you can do that. And I don't know, James, if you remember NISP back in the UK, the National Industrial Symbiosis Program, which is, you know, God, how long have I been here? 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about industrial symbiosis. How do you take process waste and turn it into an input to some other manufacturing process or something? So how do we close those loops effectively? But fundamentally, you know, one of those things that we know is kind of the impacts of kind of people wanting, you know, mass produced consumerism is one of our big issues. Is, you know, do we want to be this country that has so much stuff and we're just wasting it all? Or can we actually think about what do we need? Goes back to that point about what do we actually need? And, you know, James's point, we don't need 5 million drills. We need to be able to make a hole or whatever. And you know, and again, it's kind of, it's not just thinking about how have we done things before, and we've done things in this way and we've generated waste. So how do we make that waste more recyclable? It's like, how do we not generate that waste in the first place is kind of the question we need to be asking.
That's good. No, good. No, thank you very much. That seems to be all the questions that we have for tonight. So on behalf of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, James and Alec, in turn, I'd like to thank you very, very much for your time tonight. It's a real scene setting and I think a conversation starter for us as transport and logistics providers to actually, you know, think about how can we, as you rightly put it, Alec, you know, really think about not just basically reducing what we're doing at the moment and in the processes, etc., but actually just not doing it at all, to be blunt. And I think it's something that our industry now has actually become a key part of, and it'll be something that we really want to do more of in 2021. So James, as chair of the Northern section, I'll actually probably get in contact with you to have a chat about the opportunity for maybe some kind of project collaboration with SBN, and obviously in turn, Alec, you know, with your office, to see what we can do as our institutions together to see what we can get off the ground. Because it comes down to it, you know, as you say, COVID presents an opportunity to change and to not go back, to avoid going back to the ways that we did things before. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the participants tonight. And just a reminder that tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the CILT website within the next 48 to 72 hours, along with James and Alec's slides. And please let us continue this collective conversation because it's a very important one. So thank you very much once again, a very good evening, and to our Australian dial-in colleagues, a very good afternoon, and thank you.